Good day. Today is Monday, 30th June 2025, and as I discussed in my program yesterday, Israel, to be precise, the Israeli Defense Minister, Israel Katz, has now confirmed that Israel did indeed seek, during the 12-day war, to assassinate Iran's leader, Supreme Leader, Grand Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. And unsurprisingly, perhaps, the Iranian authorities, the Iranian government, has now complained about this revelation to the UN Security Council. I say revelation, though Iran itself is now providing some information about what it says the Israeli plan was. And it comes from the ex-head of Iran's parliament, the Majlis, Ali Larijani, a very senior Iranian politician and official, someone who was, as I remember at one time, heavily involved in the negotiations which led to the JCPOA. Anyway, he has come and said that the original Israeli plan was to carry out decapitation strikes on Thursday 12th and Friday 13th June in Iran, and that the intention was to attack both military and civilian officials at one and the same time. And, well, I will provide the text of the Iranian commentary. It says that Larijani has revealed that Israel plotted to attack a high-level meeting of Iranian officials, including heads of government, in other words, the Prime Minister, the ministers, and later the leader himself, that is to say Khamenei, but the scene was unsuccessful. The enemy's plan in this war, this is a direct quote now from Ali Larijani, was to target IRGC commanders and key national centres simultaneously. They believed they could pressure certain officials into abandoning the establishment through threats. And then he describes, this is Ali Larijani, the way in which he himself personally was threatened. On Friday, he means Friday the 13th, they contacted me, and they are the Israelis. Presumably this was done by WhatsApp or over his phone lines or in some way. Extraordinary, incidentally, that Iranian security was so weak that the Israelis were able to contact Larijani directly, but let's skip that. On Friday they contacted me and gave me 12 hours to leave Iran or to get out of Tehran, or else, they said, I'd meet the same fate as General Bagheri, the Chief of Staff of Iran's armed forces, and General Rashid, who was the commander of Iran's top military headquarters. I gave them the answer they deserved. So that is what Larijani says. He goes on to say that the US attack against what he refers to as Iran's peaceful nuclear sites of Fordow, Natanz, and Isfahan was merely a face-saving gesture. In other words, he's also in effect saying that the real target of the attack was Khamenei, the top civilian officials of the Iranian government and the top military officials of the Iranian government. They were all supposed to have been killed in the first 24 hours of the attack. Other officials who might have taken their place in Iran, such as Larijani himself, were contacted by Israeli intelligence officials and told immediately to leave Iran. And of course, the Washington Post has published a recording of the kind of threats that the Israelis apparently made to some of these Iranian officials. apparently they extended to threats against the families of some of these officials. So here you have from the Iranians, but as I said, it dovetails with what Israel Katz has said and which I discussed in my program yesterday, an account of the actual Iranian objective on Israeli objective on the 12th and 13th of June. It was the decapitation of Iran's entire leadership, the supreme leader himself, the civilian officials, including the prime minister and the other ministers of the government, and the military chiefs, if they'd all been killed at the same time, if other Iranian officials had been panicked into quitting Tehran and leaving the country, then Iran would have been left without a government or any center of political authority. And at that point, regime change, well, perhaps it would not have become inevitable, but it would have become certainly possible and perhaps even likely. Now, this, it's important to say, comes from Larijani, and of course that means it comes from an Iranian source. And what information do the Iranians have which has enabled them to reconstruct so precisely Israeli moves? Well, I don't know. They might have been provided with this information through intelligence intercepts by the Chinese and the Russians, one possibility. Or Iran might have its own intelligence gathering operations. Or it could be that the Iranians have figured it out from the pattern of events which took place on the 12th and 13th of June. Or it could be, of course, and one mustn't overlook this possibility, that Larijani is making some of this up. He's taking some of the admissions that are coming from Israel, from people like Katz, and he's putting two and two together, and he's coming up with what he says was the Israeli plan on the first 24 hours of the 12-day war. Now here I have to be especially careful because before the attack on Iran took place, I said I made my belief known. I discussed this in a program that we did on the Duran, that what Israel seemed to be heading towards was a decapitation strike on Iran's leadership. And we've had Israel Katz from the Israeli side appearing to confirm part of that. The Israelis clearly were targeting Khamenei, and as we know, they did assassinate several key figures in Iran's military. But here we also have Larijani also apparently filling in the details, explaining that Iran's civilian leadership were targeted for assassination on the first days as well, but that the Iranians got wind of the danger and managed to hide both Khamenei and the civilian leaders before the Israeli attack came. Now, as I said, I have to be careful because there is, of course, that thing which all analysts need to guard against, confirmation bias, the assumption that because what appears to be evidence comes to light, which confirms one's own belief, that evidence must be true. To repeat again, I don't know how exactly Larijani has come by all of this information. He says that he himself was one of the Iranian officials who the Israelis threatened on Friday the 13th of June. So he's saying that from direct knowledge, but I don't know how he has the rest of that information. And it may be, as I said, that he's either making it all up or that the Iranians believe that they have figured it out, and it could be that he is wrong. Having said that, with full awareness that I might be engaging in confirmation bias, I believe Larijani. I think this is exactly what the Israelis were trying to do. They tried to murder Khamenei. They tried to murder the top leaders of Iran's civilian leadership. They succeeded in killing the top leaders of Iran's military leadership. And they threatened those officials that they weren't directly targeting for killing in order to get them to panic and to leave Tehran and perhaps indeed Iran altogether, creating a political vacuum, a leadership vacuum in Tehran, which would have caused the collapse of the regime, or so the Israelis hoped. I think this is probably what the Israelis did plan and what they intended should take place. And if that is correct, and as I've made clear, I believe it is correct, then we can see how the operation failed. Because Khamenei and the civilian leadership survived, and the result was that even though several of the top military officials were killed, there were enough civilian officials and Khamenei still alive in Tehran to fill the vacancies that had been created, and they moved with extreme speed to fill those vacancies, so that within the space of a few hours, even despite a massive cyber attack that had blocked operation of the Iranian air defense system, and despite the assassination of key military officials, Iran was able to stabilize and reorganize and launch missile strikes against Israel. The worst outcome, as the Israelis themselves admitted, the worst outcome came to pass. Iran survived and withstood the blow and came back fighting. And that shows that the Israeli attack failed right at the outset. Israel was not looking for a prolonged war against Iran. It presumably understands that it does not have the resources to win such a long war. It needed the United States thereafter to come in order to take control of the situation and in order to try to force a ceasefire. And the way that the Americans did it was by launching their strikes against the Iranian nuclear facilities and then signaling to the Iranians that the United States was looking for a ceasefire. In other words, the Israeli operation failed within the first 24 hours. Now that's, as I said, accords with my own understanding and assessment of events. Probably prior to the attack, Donald Trump was given assurances by the Israelis that the Israeli attack would succeed, that the Israelis knew the whereabouts of all of the top Iranian officials, Khamenei, the civilian leaders, the military leaders. The Israelis assured Trump that it would be over within 24 to 48 hours. As the news trickled in that the top military officials were being killed, Trump couldn't restrain himself and spoke out in support of an operation which he expected would succeed, giving away his own involvement in it. But then, of course, when it failed, he found himself in a difficult situation. And we saw all of the complex maneuvers that followed over the next couple of days leading up to the strike on the facilities, the Iranian nuclear facilities at Fordow, Natanz, and Isfahan. Now, I'm going to suggest that this information from Israel Katz in Israel and from Larijani in Iran provides us with the clearest understanding of the 12-day war. The 12-day war, despite endless commentary that we have seen in the West, and in Israel, of course, also, ultimately was a failure. The objective was the decapitation of Iran's leadership and regime change in Iran, and that objective was not achieved. Now, the other objective, the secondary objective, the attack on the nuclear sites, probably the pretext rather than the real purpose of the attack on Iran. Anyway, I'm now coming increasingly to the conclusion, based on various studies and reports that I've seen in foreign policy, from various engineers and people of that kind, that most probably the Iranian nuclear sites have indeed survived, well, I won't say undamaged, but mostly intact, and that they are indeed repairable, as the Iranians have been saying. I don't know this for a fact, and I doubt that anybody outside a small circle of people in Iran fully does. But there appears to be activity on the ground in at least Fordow and Natanz. There's been satellite pictures which show Iranian recovery teams and parties apparently clearing rubble from the entrances at Fordow and Natanz. And presumably they would not be doing that, at least not at this time, when it would be perhaps dangerous to do that, unless they didn't think that the facilities overall, deep below the surface, have in some way survived. And I've expressed my own entirely inexpert views in the past about possible damage to the facilities. I've spoken about the damage caused to the centrifuges from cut-off of power supplies. I've spoken about the massive vibrations from the bombs, the heavy bombs. But I have to say that various articles I've read by engineers have countered every one of those arguments. It's always possible, apparently, to create backup electrical systems, and one can perhaps, at least to some extent, counter the effect of vibrations by ensuring that the flooring where the centrifuges of the rooms where the centrifuges are located are suspended on springs. And I'm not going to try and discuss and explain all that, because if I did, I would be going far outside my knowledge and would probably be making a fool of myself, which I have no intention of doing. But all I will say is that the general consensus appears to be that ensuring the proofing of these facilities from precisely the kind of bomb attack that has taken place is something within, apparently, the levels of engineering expertise and technical competence that Iran undoubtedly has. And given the importance of these facilities, one must assume, and we can only work on the basis of assumptions, that the Iranians did take those precautions. So anyway, the aggregate information suggests that the nuclear facilities probably survive. Obviously, they've taken damage. Obviously, it will take weeks or months to get them back into operation, if that is, by the way, the Iranian plan. but probably they have survived, even if, as some people like Seymour Hersh and others believe, the enriched uranium is still deep down inside Fordow. Probably the Iranians will be able to access it over the next couple of days. The Iranians, of course, say that it isn't in Fordow anyway anymore, that it was moved to other locations, and that does seem to be the general view amongst intelligence officials in the United States, in Europe, and apparently in Israel as well. So, the Iranian government has survived, it's withstood the blow, and it still has the basis of an enrichment program. Now, a couple of days ago, I spoke about a series of comments made by the Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi, and I pointed out that in response to various comments that Donald Trump was making, and by the way, Rafael Grossi, the director of the International Atomic Energy Agency, was making, it appeared to me that Iran was now hinting that it might be prepared to move forward to acquiring a nuclear weapon. I did say in that program where I commented on all of that it didn't seem to me that a final decision had been made. It looks as if a debate within Iran on this topic continues. And today, I have to say that there is an article in the Tasmin news agency, and it says that spokesman for the Iranian Foreign Ministry, Ismail Bakay, vehemently refuted Israel's claim that Tehran has a clandestine program to develop nuclear weapons. And he apparently said that to Russian television. He said that Iran has no plans to obtain nuclear weapons, but reserves the right to enrich uranium for civilian use. And he went on to say that Iran has never secretly developed nuclear weapons, which was cited as the justification for the military attacks. And he also made some very, very strong criticisms of Rafael Grossi, on top of the various other criticisms that the Iranians have been making. Now, I think it's worth saying that this Iranian official was speaking on Russian television, Russian international television, I should say. So, in a sense, he was addressing the Russians. And as I've said already, the Russians are strongly opposed to Iran ever acquiring nuclear weapons. They've made that clear many times. China is the same. And perhaps an Iranian official would not tell the Russians in any format that the Iranians were reconsidering that idea. Having said that, Iranian media are giving Bakay's comments significant prominence, which suggests either that a decision has now been made not to proceed with acquiring a nuclear weapons capability, or, as I personally think is much more likely, that there is still a debate going on and that the various factions or groups within the Iranian political system are still arguing over this issue with each other, and that the somewhat contradictory statements that you see coming from Iranian officials reflect that internal debate that continues to take place within Iran. Now, here I am going to express my own clear view. I think that one way or the other, Iran needs to make a decision soon as to what it is going to do. It seems to me that it has three options. which it can follow. Either it can decide to resume negotiations with the United States to see whether a deal, similar perhaps to the JCPOA, can be negotiated after all. The New York Times says that the prevailing faction within the Iranian government is still committed to this course, and on the American Conservative, the former US State Department official Peter Van Buren says that this is the approach that he thinks Iran ultimately will take, that they will put aside all that has happened, the attempt to murder their leader, to kill every member of their government, the actual murder of the top military officials, the attack on their nuclear sites. They will nonetheless recognize the immense power of the United States. They will not want to commit to long-term alliances with the Chinese and the Russians. They still have a fundamental aversion to acquiring nuclear weapons, and perhaps understand the immense dangers to Iran of doing so, and that they will ultimately drift back to the course of negotiating with the United States. Well, it is an option, but I have to say that if it is the option the Iranians choose to take, it will certainly be interpreted in Washington and Israel as an admission of weakness. And unless the Iranians are prepared to make fundamental concessions, such as giving up entirely on their whole nuclear enrichment program, it is difficult to see how these negotiations could succeed, and how further Israeli and American attacks on Iran could be avoided. Almost certainly, as Israel Katz said in the program that I made yesterday, the Israelis have not abandoned their objective of achieving regime change in Iran. Israel Katz made it absolutely clear that the Israelis still seek the assassination of Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei. And sooner or later, given what has happened, there's every reason to think if the Iranians follow the negotiation course, that another attack will take place. I am guessing that it will not be very long. In fact, probably sometime in the late summer might be a reasonable guess. By then, the Israelis will have rebuilt their armory. They will have acquired more missiles and more weapons, and they will, at that point, be in a position to go on the attack again. So that is one option. The second option is to do what the Russians and the Chinese are urging them to do, which is to establish a military relationship with Russia and China. Now, here I'm going to express again my deep frustration. I continue to read all sorts of accounts and statements, and I receive emails, all of which say that the Russians, especially, it's always the Russians more than the Chinese, stood by and did nothing, even as Israel and the United States were attacking Iran, and that the Russians in some way failed Iran over the course of that attack. Now, the first thing to say about that is that there is no evidence at all, none whatsoever that I have seen, that Iran actually asked Russia, or China for that matter, with military assistance whilst the 12-day war was underway. Maybe they did, but not a scintilla of evidence exists to suggest that they did. And President Putin of Russia has said quite clearly that they did not. Secondly, we know, because Putin has told us, that before the 12-day war took place, the Russians at least did offer Iran military assistance. They offered Iran an integrated air defense system, work on an integrated air defense system. They offered Iran a defense agreement, modeled apparently on the one that Russia has with North Korea. And the Iranians showed no interest in the first and rejected the second, which caused the agreement of the partnership treaty, to be delayed. Now, on this, I've already said in previous programs that I'd received information from a source that the Russians had indeed offered Iran a integrated air defense system, more than just batches of S-300 and modified S-200 missiles, which is what Iran had previously sought and received, but a full air defense system. And the source who provided me with that information contacted me again last night. And I should say that this source obtained his information from Russia, and it is very detailed. And he reminded me that he provided me with this information in December. I'm not going to say exactly when in December. And he provided me with many details then, that is to say, in December, of the nature of the air defense system that the Russians were offering to Iran. And apparently, and this he did tell me in December, but I admit I'd overlooked it, apparently there was intended to be a clause in the partnership agreement, the one that the Russians and the Iranians eventually signed, and which their two parliaments have ratified, which actually covered the setting up and establishment of this air defense system. So I have absolutely no doubt that, exactly as Putin says, that offer of an air defense system was put forward by the Russians back in, at least in December 2024, and I am going to guess much earlier, perhaps more than a year earlier. Now, the Iranians rejected it. They rejected that assistance from the Russians, and there's no reason to think that they were offered similar assistance at that time from the Chinese, or indeed from anyone else, or that they would have accepted offers of assistance from the Chinese or anyone else had those offers been made. So that is the reality of this. Now, the Iranians, and this in my opinion would be the best course that they can take in this situation, given that they are under constant threat now of a renewal of the American-Iranian attack upon them. In my opinion, their best stance would be to accept those offers of help previously made by the Russians, and of course solicit further offers of help from the Chinese also, assuming that those offers of help from the Chinese would come. And by the way, I have no doubt that they would as well. During the Shanghai Cooperation Organization Defense Ministers meeting in China, the one that I discussed several programs ago, it appears that the Iranian defense minister took the opportunity to examine China's JC-10 fighter jet, the one which the Pakistanis successfully used in fighting the Indians and which defeated, or so we're told, the Rafale fighter jets the Indian Air Force had been provided by France. Now, many are suggesting that this means that Iran is now thinking of buying the JC-10 in preference to the Sukhoi 35. A wiser plan would be to seek to acquire both. I say that because getting help from both the Russians and the Chinese seems to me to make perfect sense and means that Iran is widening the circle of its military allies and friends. I cannot imagine that the Russians would object to Iran acquiring JC-10 fighter jets from China, and I absolutely cannot imagine that the Chinese would object to Iran acquiring Sukhoi 35 jets from Russia. The point is that, to my knowledge, a contract for Sukhoi 35s either already exists or has been negotiated, and apparently or allegedly these specific fighter jets are available or are in production and will be available for supply to Iran fairly soon. Iran anyway would have the problem that Brian Belletti has discussed many times in connection with Ukraine, which is that it takes a very long time to integrate modern equipment like advanced fighter jets and air defense systems into a military system which has no familiarity with the underlying technology. And this is why the offer of Russian technical assistance to create an air defense system is probably absolutely something that Iran should accept. Because if the Russians come into Iran and actually start working directly with the Iranians to build an air defense system there, then that will probably foreshorten the times needed to get that air defense system up and running, as opposed to a situation where the Iranians are simply provided with air defense technology, some S-400s, some Sukhoi 35s and JC-10s, and have to work out for themselves how to use them, a process that might take many years which Iran does not have. So that is course 2, and it is the one that I recommend, would recommend if I was advising the Iranian government. The third course is, of course, to go nuclear. And this is something that perhaps, if the reports about the survival of Iran's nuclear enrichment program and its facilities and the preservation of its uranium stockpile are true, Iran could do within perhaps a year, and which perhaps would provide security, long-term security for Iran, and which would preserve independence, full independence for Iran from its Russian and Chinese allies. Obviously, when a country like Iran enters into long-term alliances with countries like Russia and China, both much more powerful than itself, the risk it runs is becoming subordinate to those countries. That goes completely against the DNA of the Islamic Republic that was established in Iran after 1979, one which sought complete independence for Iran. It's probably an unpopular idea with the Iranian people for obvious, very obvious reasons. And I believe that it is also in conflict with Iran's constitution and many parts of its basic laws. I can remember back in 2015 when the Russians intervened in Syria. They were for a brief time using Iranian bases in Iran as staging points for their aircraft to reach Syria. And in fact, there were photographs of Russian fighter jets operating from the Iranian airfields. And as I also very well remember, that provoked a storm of protests in the Iranian parliament, by the way, from hardline conservative MPs, the very people who believe in a strong line being taken by Iran against the United States and Israel. They protested that the presence of the Russian fighter jets on these Iranian airfields violated Iran's constitution because it amounted to making those airfields a military base, a Russian military base, contrary to Iran's constitution and basic laws. So one can see that this is going to be a difficult thing for Iran to do. It would mean revisiting many of the assumptions upon which the Islamic Revolution is based, and it would not be without political risks. But as somebody who earnestly believes in preserving the nuclear non-proliferation regime, it is the course I personally believe Iran should take. The alternative of moving forward with a nuclear bomb would inevitably strain Iran's relations with Russia and China, though doubtless they would eventually come to terms with it, as they have come to terms with North Korea doing it. But it would expose Iran to enormous risks of an Israeli and American attack as Iran proceeded with its program. So those are the three options. Negotiate with the Americans and hope for a deal. Forge military alliance with the Chinese and the Russians, or go nuclear. Iran must opt for one of these courses. If it fails to do so, if this interminable debate that has raged in Iran, as far as I can see for many years, continues indefinitely in the same way that it has done, then sooner or later Iran will be attacked again. It may find itself as unprepared for that attack as it was on the 12th and 13th of June. It undoubtedly avoided disaster on the 12th and 13th of June because of certain precautions that the Iranian leadership appears to have taken. But perhaps there was also an element of good fortune. Perhaps the Iranian civilian officials and the supreme leader himself just weren't where the Israelis expected them to be, in which case Iran had a lucky escape, and it should not expect the same all over again. Anyway, that is, in my opinion, the situation in this crisis today. I've discussed it at extreme length. I don't intend now, unless there are any new developments, to return to this topic. For the moment, the Iranians continue to refuse to negotiate with the Americans, even as they insist that they're not going to acquire nuclear weapons, and as they insist that they are not going to allow the IAEA back into Iran. These are contradictory positions. Keeping the IAEA out makes perfect sense if you're going to align with the Russians and the Chinese, or if you are going to go nuclear, but it doesn't make much sense if you have no intention of going nuclear and intend to negotiate with the United States. Negotiating with the United States is inconsistent with acquiring a nuclear capability, and probably also with forging an alliance with the Russians and the Chinese. And as for negotiating with the United States and keeping the IAEA out, but forging closer relations with the Chinese and the Russians, doing those sort of things might make the Chinese and the Russians cautious and wondering whether Iran is really serious about the alliance it appears to be talking about. So as I said, these are not fully consistent positions. They seem to me to suggest continued incoherence at the center of Iranian policy and Iranian governance, and it is an incoherence which, in light of the threat to the country, Iran simply cannot afford. Anyway, we will see what the Iranians do. For the moment, it seems to me they have a few weeks or months of time. Israel has to re-equip, so does the United States. If we're talking about more attacks on Iranian nuclear sites, the United States is now short of the big bombs. It used up 2/3 of them on the one attack that it has carried out. So Iran probably has a few weeks or months of grace before the situation starts to deteriorate again. But one mustn't assume that this pause is forever. As I've discussed many times, when it comes to the neocons in the United States, they have no reverse gear on these questions. When it comes to the Israelis, they've worked themselves up into this belief that Iran is the major threat to them and to their regional ambitions, and perhaps even, in the case of a few people in Israel, the survival of the state itself. Sooner or later, if Iran doesn't make a decision, the attack will come. Bear in mind that at the Duran, at various points over the last 2 years, Alex and I have discussed possible attacks against Iran. We've had deployments of huge American fleets around Iran, positioning of American aircraft at various bases in the Middle East. It's looked many times as if an attack on Iran was about to happen. Prime Minister Netanyahu and his officials have spoken about this almost continuously. An attack eventually did take place. The Iranians would be utterly wrong in supposing that it would be the last one. Anyway, that's my assessment of the situation for the moment in the Middle East, in the conflict between Iran and the United States, and Iran and Israel as well. Now, a lot of things are happening on the battlefields in Ukraine, and it seems to me that at this point, some kind of rundown of the situation there, a rather fuller summary than I've been providing recently, might be in order. The Russians again launched a massive drone and missile attack across Ukraine last night. It was not on the scale of the attack that they launched the night before. That attack was, in terms of the overall number of drones and missiles launched by Russia against Ukraine, the biggest single attack of the war. And interestingly, the Russians were targeting sites all across Ukraine. They were hitting targets in western Ukraine, in central Ukraine. They were going for infrastructure. They were going for drone factories and plants. They were attacking cement factories, places like Kryvyi Rog, factories which produce the cement and concrete used by Ukraine to build fortifications. Some of these attacks, by the way, took place in cities and towns immediately to the west of the Dnieper, Kryvyi Rog being a particular target. And I wonder whether that doesn't suggest that the Russian objective is an eventual crossing of the Dnieper precisely in this central region of Ukraine, near Zaporozhye and Dnipro, and an eventual advance towards the cities of Nikopol, Kryvyi Rog, Nikolaev, and ultimately Odessa itself. Just saying. Anyway, according to various reports, the drone factory in Kazan in Russia is now producing around 500 Geran drones a day. Some have expressed skepticism about this figure. I'm not sure why. The Russians supposedly have around 3,500 of these drones in storage. The plans are to increase production of Geran drones at this factory further still to around 700 a day, or maybe even 1,000 a day. Just think that would mean around 360,000 drones a year if production was maintained at that kind of level. Anyway, one can see that Ukraine is getting swamped by the sheer number of missiles and drones that the Russians are able to launch against Ukraine. And given that the Russians can maintain this level of output of drones, they can do this every night. It's not like missiles, where the Russians used to produce perhaps 100 missiles a month. It now is assumed that that figure has grown, though I don't know by how much. But typically, classically, at the height of the missile wars, the Russians would launch around 2 big strikes of missiles against Ukraine every month. Now they can launch attacks with Geran drones every night. And the Iranian air defenses are getting swamped because of the sheer number of drones. The F-16 that Ukraine lost 2 days ago, apparently, according to the Ukrainians, was lost because it was shooting down. The pilot shot down 7 drones, but he found it difficult to keep control of the aircraft because of all the maneuvers he was doing, and the drones, when they were hit, would explode, and some of the fragments apparently interfered with the F-16 and were what brought it down. So even the F-16s cannot withstand a drone offensive on this scale. And that's, of course, assuming that it wasn't actually the Russians using long-range missiles who shot this F-16 down, which must be a possibility, by the way. Anyway, the Russians, as I said, able to maintain this attack on Ukraine every single day. And there are reports also that the Russians are now making very significant breakthroughs along the front lines. So yesterday, reports appeared on the various Telegram channels that the Russians had captured the village of Kamenskoye, south of the city of Zaporozhye. A film has appeared of a Russian soldier raising the Russian flag in the center of this village. There are some claims that the Ukrainians are defending still positions in the north of this village. Others are saying that the Russians have actually captured this village in its entirety. The point about this village is that it is apparently within long-range artillery range of Zaporozhye city itself. I doubt that the Russians can maintain a constant barrage against Zaporozhye from this village, but it seems that they can nonetheless, from time to time at least, hit this city. And the Russians apparently have made further progress in Malaya Tokmachka, in Zaporozhye region, north of Rabotino. They apparently have captured around half of this village, according to some reports, and have either isolated or have entered in and are fighting inside the women's prison, which is the major fortified position that the Ukrainians have in Malaya Tokmachka. And the Russians are also pushing hard around the small town of Gulyapolye, a little further to the east, and that they have largely finished the battle for the village of Malinivka there. Now, all of this is happening as the Russians continue to advance westwards from Komar, which they captured recently. And there are reports that the Russians are now pushing northwards from Komar to various northwestwards from Komar, trying to take various villages in that particular area. Now, what makes all this interesting is that the map I have of this area with the city of Zaporozhye identifiable as the main object on the map, located on the Dnieper River, the east bank of the Dnieper River, now shows all of these places. It shows Kamenskoye, the village which the Russians have captured. Well, that's not far away, south of Zaporozhye. It shows Malaya Tokmachka and Gulyapolye also. But it also shows Komar and some of the other places that the Russian army, advancing from the east, from central Donbass, is now moving towards. You're starting to see a massive convergence of the various groups of forces, group of forces Dnieper, the group of forces that used to be based around Vuhledar and which is also fighting in Gulyapolye, and group of forces center, as all of these various groups of forces advance and appear to be converging from the south, the southeast, and from the east towards the city of Zaporozhye. Now, there are significant distances still to go, especially if we're talking about the eastern advance. But to repeat again, all of this is now coming within the map that I have been accustomed to use to try to follow the various battles that have been happening in Zaporozhye and Kherson region since the Ukrainian offensive of the summer of 2023. You can suddenly see the Russians present in multiple parts of it. And as I said, they're gradually, perhaps not so gradually actually, quite quickly in fact, moving closer, slowly, towards Zaporozhye and to the central area of the Dnieper. And all of this is connected to what is going on in central Donbass, where there is a mighty battle underway around Pokrovsk and Konstantinovka. The Russians are on the advance in both of these places. There's been a lot more information over the last 24 hours about the fighting north and east of Pokrovsk. It's now acknowledged that the Russians did enter Novoekonomichny. Apparently these were reconnaissance units. They've not made attempts so far to hold their ground in Novoekonomichny. But the Russians are apparently very close to Novoekonomichny, better understood as a small town, by the way, rather than a village. They're very close to the south and east and north of Novoekonomichny. And there are some reports that the Russians are intending to storm Novoekonomichny very quickly. And Radovka suggested that one of the reasons they want to do that is because between Novoekonomichny and Mirnograd, there is a large coal mine with various big concrete industrial facilities, and the Russians want to break the Ukrainian defenses and capture this coal mine before the Ukrainians are able to fortify this coal mine properly. But anyway, there's a mighty battle, as I said, taking place there. And there is also a mighty battle going on southwest of Pokrovsk, near the village of Udachny, which the Russians are now attacking from both the east and the south, and which they're likely to capture at some point, my guessing, within the next couple of days, with a probable objective to advance north to complete the encirclement of Pokrovsk within the next couple of days or weeks. And yesterday I spoke about how Andrei Marochko says that there is now fighting going on in the southern suburbs of Pokrovsk, and apparently there's now film footage and visual and photographs which appear to confirm this. So some fighting is now taking place in the southern areas of Pokrovsk itself, even as the Russian army is converging rapidly around it. One could start to see how the offensive is starting to take shape. The Russian offensive is starting to take shape. I should say that over the last couple of days, about the last week, the various frontline positions have been hosting important Russian military visitors. General Gerasimov, the chief of the general staff and overall commander, has been there. And I understand General Mordvichev, the former head of Group of Forces Center, which is one of the groups of forces involved in these operations, and now the overall commander of the ground forces. I believe he has been in this area as well, though I am not absolutely sure about this. Anyway, you can see the way the Russian offensive is shaping up. An attempt to capture Pokrovsk, a plan to ultimately capture Pokrovsk, to do two things. One is to break through towards the Dnieper, to carry out an advance from multiple directions towards the city of Zaporozhye and perhaps Dnipro a little further to the north, and also an outflanking operation to break Ukrainian defenses in the Slavyansk-Kramatorsk conurbation, where the situation of the Ukrainians in the area south of Konstantinovka, as I've discussed in several programs, is now critical and is apparently deteriorating by the day. Now, it is important to say that this whole area, these cities, these towns, Pokrovsk, Slavyansk, Kramatorsk, Konstantinovka, make up Ukraine's main, in fact, only remaining fortified line in Donbass. The Russians have broken through all of the other fortified positions that the Ukrainians had, as they have now reached this final fortified line. It is perhaps in some ways the strongest of these lines, in the sense that we're talking about large urban communities, but then that doesn't necessarily follow, because we don't know how developed the fortifications in these places are. If the Russians are able to break through this fortified line and are able to capture these towns, and my own sense is that in the case of Konstantinovka certainly, and in the case of Pokrovsk probably, the fall of any one of these places will probably lead to the collapse of the others quickly, like a fall of dominoes. Well, if that happens, then, as I said, the major fortified lines that the Ukrainians have developed east of the Dnieper will have collapsed, and it will be very, very difficult for the Ukrainians to hold positions anywhere else east of the Dnieper, and this will have implications for Ukrainian defense further north in places like Chernigov and Sumy and Kharkiv region, and in all of those places too. Now, I'm not going to discuss what's going on in those areas. In Volchansk, it looks as if the Russians have now completed some time ago the battle for northern Volchansk and are now fighting for southern Volchansk, south of the Volcha River. In Sumy region, the Ukrainians are engaging in a rather desperate counterattack to stop the Russians advancing further towards Sumy itself. The Russians are taking advantage of that, it seems to me, to grind down the Ukrainian forces by defeating their counteroffensives. As I said, I'm not going to discuss this in further or more detail. There's a lot going on in the Liman, Siversk area too. Suffice to say, all of these places are important. In all of these places, the Russians retain the strategic initiative. But the point is that the key places, it seems to me, are Pokrovsk, Slavyansk, Kramatorsk, Konstantinovka, with a ultimate Russian objective to break through the last big remaining defense line and then advance towards the Dnieper. Now, even as I'm saying all of these things, a narrative is being circulated again across the media. It's been picked up by the Daily Telegraph, by CNN, that the Russian offensive is underwhelming. That was CNN's word. It is also claimed by the Daily Telegraph that the Russian offensive has stalled. By the way, if you go to the article that the Daily Telegraph has written under the title that the Russian offensive has stalled, you will discover that that is in fact far from being the case, but never mind. Anyway, there is this narrative that is being circulated to try to persuade people that this is the case, but it is not true. And today in the Financial Times, there is an article by Gideon Rachman the Financial Times' foreign news editor, I believe, or at least certainly he's a very well informed and connected commentator from the Financial Times. And he, on the contrary, is speaking about a critical situation for Ukraine on the battlefields. And I should say that Gideon Ratman is a fervid supporter of Ukraine. He says that NATO summit cannot disguise Ukraine's plight. Without more military aid, Kiev's situation on the battlefield could deteriorate rapidly. And then he says that whilst the NATO summit meeting did not end in any disaster, NATO leaders fear that the situation on the front line in Ukraine could deteriorate seriously by this autumn. Military assessments suggest that both the Russian and Ukrainian militaries are nearing the point of exhaustion. That is certainly not true of the Russian military. As we've discussed in many programs, the Russians have at least 2 reserve armies in the rear. In fact, they have more, and they are not short of reserves or men, and their equipment levels are growing. But anyway, Gideon Ratman continues, while Russia can probably keep up the level of operations for another year, in fact it can do it for much longer, Ukraine may reach a breaking point within 6 months if it does not receive significant new military support. And we are then told that the increased intensity of Russian missile attacks on Kiev and other Ukrainian cities is damaging Ukraine's morale. Without a clear vision of victory, or at least of an end to the war, a sense of hopelessness risks descending over the country. The change of mood inside the Ukrainian government is reflected in the urgency with which it is now privately calling for a ceasefire. A year or 2 ago, such calls would have been regarded as defeatism. Absolutely. That was the case, in fact, until about 6 months ago. Now they are made with increasing insistence in closed-door meetings between Ukrainian and Western leaders. There is little belief among European policymakers that Russia is in any mood to agree a ceasefire. One well-placed official thinks that Russia's central goal is now to capture Odessa. Well, we've discussed that in many places. He then goes on to say a group of former European leaders, including Carl Bildt of Sweden, a very, very hardline figure in terms of Western attitudes towards Russia, just to say, and Sanna Marin of Finland. She was the prime minister who took Finland into NATO, visited Ukraine recently and picked up on the deteriorating mood. They wrote afterwards that while Ukrainians will never stop resisting, without more military support, Ukraine can lose more territory, more cities might be captured. Off the record, this is clearly, Gideon Ratman is now clearly talking about information that has been conveyed directly to him. Off the record, some Western officials are even bleaker, warning of a risk of catastrophic failure if the Ukrainian military is stretched to breaking point and does not receive a significant increase in military and financial aid from its Western allies. And of course, there is no sign or reason to think that anything of that kind is going to happen. Now, what Gideon Ratman is talking about is fully consistent with the messaging and signalling that's coming from Kiev. Zelensky and his officials, who a year ago scorned any idea of a ceasefire, are now increasingly pleading for one. They are not prepared, however, to make any substantive concessions, and in fact, they continue to make demands of the Russians, which the Russians will never agree to, such as to submit to war crimes trials, for example. And they also are making clear that they are no longer interested in the Istanbul process, the direct talks with Russia, which Putin and Trump insisted upon back in May. So, Ukraine, desperate for a ceasefire, Western officials worried about catastrophic failure of the Ukrainian army, and Gideon Rachman tells us that there's now a growing mood that Ukraine could start to collapse within 6 months. Yesterday, I read reports that Novoekonomichny had actually been captured by the Russians. I don't believe those claims, but one can already sense that things are moving faster and faster. A while back, Budanov said that if by midsummer, and I believe he meant August, things didn't change, there wasn't a political solution, the situation would become catastrophic for Ukraine. We can see how that is playing out. Ukraine is short of men, it is short of machines. The Russians have an abundance of both. They're hitting Ukraine every night, and they're advancing further and faster. But there is no sign of any political or diplomatic movement. On unheard, Wolfgang Munchau, German commentator, intelligent man in many ways, talked about the structural decline of Europe and discussed how Europe has lost the ability to do diplomacy. The title of the article is Europe Needs a Metternich. It's basically a way of saying that one indicator of decline is when you invent something, but others become better than you at using it. Europeans invented modern diplomacy, but they're no longer able to do it anymore. And then there's a long and, in my opinion, rather pointless discussion of Metternich and Talleyrand, the diplomats of the 19th century, but about his essential point that the Europeans have no diplomatic strategy in this point of crisis, any more, by the way, than they have any coherent economic strategy or rearmament strategy, is true. He says at the end that all of this points to systemic decline. What I'm describing here is long-term structural decline. Decline could, in theory, be reversed, but that would require a level of political will that is totally absent in every single European country I know. I don't know a single politician or a single political party in any European country with a clear focus on the important issues. Denial and wishful thinking are another important metric of decline. All my indicators are flashing red. And I agree with him. It is even more of a symptom of decline when you can see the catastrophe that is coming, like those officials who have spoken to Gideon Rachman. You can see that a collapse is on its way in Ukraine, but you can do nothing to prevent it. Nothing. You can find no idea, no strategy to avoid the consequences of it. You are, in that case, absolutely, and in fact, the rabbit caught in the headlights of the oncoming car. Well, the other side is not gripped by these kind of issues. Now, it has gone completely unnoticed, but the Russians have now begun providing naval escorts for their merchant ships. There's been an article about this in the Daily Telegraph by a former naval officer, by the way, British naval officer, Tom Sharp. It is wrong in almost everything it says, in my opinion, but never mind. It's titled, by the way, just to give a sense of what it's all about, will give you a feeling of the kind of article it is. Putin's latest desperate escalation has created a new flashpoint for war with the West. The dictator is desperate to keep his shadow fleet of oil tankers operating. Never mind all of that. What the article confirms, and he is a naval officer, former naval officer, and therefore on these matters well advised, he confirms that a Russian Navy corvette, the Boyki, was confirmed to have actively escorted two tankers, Selva and Sierra, through the English Channel to the Russian Baltic ports. They are not just any tankers, both form part of the so-called shadow fleet, vessels operating in circumvention of Western oil sanctions on Russia. In effect, the G7 price cap. And he goes on to say that the corvette in question, Boyki, is a Steregushi class vessel, already well known to the Russian Royal Navy. And in fact, it's quite an advanced, quite a modern vessel at that. I gather it's been built within the last 10 years or so. And it's certainly a match for the Royal Navy frigates who went to track it down, of which, by the way, Britain has very few. But anyway, the Russians have begun the process of providing naval escorts for their merchant ships, their oil tankers, which are now travelling into and out of the Baltic Sea. And I assume that that is going to have a deterrent effect on any attempts by the Western powers to interfere with Russian marine traffic. And the Russians are perfectly capable of maintaining this protection for their merchant fleets. In fact, it will increase the proficiency of their navy. So they have plans. They know what they're doing. They sense that on the battlefields, events are moving in their direction. What we're doing in the West, in the face of all of this, I don't pretend any longer that I even know. Well, this is where I finish today's program. Let me remind you again, you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and subscribe stone by going to our shop, links under this video. Last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.